So, welcome back. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to the panel on making dispute resolution work, strengthening the mutual agreement procedure or MAP. By way of introduction, my name is Sriram Govind, and I'm the co-head of the tax certainty unit at the OECD CTP. We have a big panel uh, with competent authorities as well as business to have a discussion on MAP and tax certainty here today. But before we start the discussion, a quick word, I think, to repeat logistics, which we had mentioned before, that through the session, we will be having the panel discussion, but feel free to add questions in the Q&A section. Our team will try and respond to those questions as the session goes along, but we will try and keep some questions at the end as well if time permits. So to start the panel, I will start with some opening remarks, and I will start with the fact that MAP is, of course, part of our broader tax certainty agenda. It's important to highlight that tax certainty as a concept is a priority in our work program. Countries that have invested in tax certainty programs have reiterated that these programs play a key role in development, and hence we have this topic on the agenda today. Tax certainty and the work on tax certainty includes three verticals. Of course, the work to simplify the rules and administer the rules. You heard a little bit about the simplification work in the transfer pricing space, especially on Amount B in the last panel. We have the work on dispute prevention, which of course includes the work on tools such as APAs and programs such as ICAP, but also a little bit broader for dispute prevention on how we can create an environment of trust between tax administrations and taxpayers generally. And finally, the work on dispute resolution, which focuses on the MAP, which we cover today. So today's panel will focus on MAP and the work done to make dispute resolution more effective. So since 2016, because of the work done on MAP under BEPS Action 14, MAP has been working better than ever before. A few points that I can raise here is that we have gone from only around 50 jurisdictions who had MAP cases in 2016 to around 100 in 2024. That means that more and more countries are coming into the MAP program. And I think that that's because taxpayers have more and more trust in MAP in more countries. We see that access to MAP is now widely available for all eligible cases under tax treaties, except for some exceptions. We see access to MAP is generally working much better and I think almost close to terminal velocity in a sense in 2024. We have more and more countries publishing MAP guidance, MAP profiles, allowing taxpayers and other competent authorities to know when and how to proceed with MAP under their tax treaties and jurisdictions. Competent authorities generally, and we know this from the FTA MAP Forum, have developed deeper and better, stronger working relationships and have better resources to deal with MAP cases in general because of this work. And of course, I think I should mention that the peer review process, which we have done under BEPS Action 14 and the discussions in the FTA MAP Forum have meant that there is a great focus on endeavors to resolve MAP cases and overcoming hurdles to implementation as well. So a lot has been achieved from BEPS Action 14 and the work done therein. We also have competent authorities committing to follow some best practice in this sense and committing to have aspirations to consider these best practices on how MAP is conducted, right? So the 2026 revision of the OECD Manual on Effective Maps, the MEMAP, is what I would highlight here. It includes 59 best practices across the life cycle of the MAP process, where competent authorities have shown their aspiration to continue resolving MAP with a solution-oriented approach. It covers everything from measures that could be taken by a tax administration to prevent disputes, how an ideal competent authority function should be organized, how access to MAP can be effectively enabled. It goes into the real spirit of endeavoring to resolve MAP cases and how MAP agreements can be effectively implemented as well. So with those introductory words, we have a great panel with us here to discuss some of these questions and the topics of how having an effective MAP program can generally contribute to development as well. First, we have Harmark Pitt, who is the chair of the FTA MAP Forum and is process coordinator at the Competent Authority of the Netherlands. Then we have Dr. Vinay Kumar Singh, who's joint secretary in the Foreign Taxes and Tax Research Function at the Indian Central Board of Direct Taxes and acts as one of India's designated competent authorities for MAP cases. Then we have Ms. Mvoli Mbula, who is Manager International Tax Policy and Relations in the Zambian Revenue Authority and is part of Zambia's competent authority function. And finally, we have a voice from business, the users of MAP, Ms. Rocio Bermudez, who's Transfer Pricing and Tax Policy Senior Manager at Repsol. So to start off the panel, I think we can start off with the broader segment than MAP. We zoom out a little bit to think about tax certainty and the role of an effective competent authority function to create tax certainty and that environment that focuses on development and growth. So maybe I start with you, Rosio. From the perspective in M&E that has strong investments across the globe, when operating in developing countries, how important do you think is an effective competent authority function for MAP and APS in giving tax certainty needed to you to operate with confidence? And when that function works well, do you think that it actually affects business behavior and practice?
Thank you very much, Sriram, for the invitation and the opportunity to exchange views on this topic, because as you mentioned, tax certainty is absolutely key for businesses, and I'm glad to share our perspective on it. Obviously, tax certainty is not about paying more or less taxes. It's about creating stable and predictable frameworks that allow multinational enterprises to invest and operate and plan with confidence. And from the perspective of a group like Repsol, with significant cross-border operations, including in developing countries, tax certainty is not only a technical or an abstract concept, it's a core enabler of investments, of value creation, and of risk management. Because in capital-intensive and long-cycle businesses, such as energy, infrastructure, or natural resources, strategic decisions on supply chain, on financing, on reorganizations require predictable tax outcomes across jurisdictions. When uncertainty is prolonged, it affects investment decisions, it increases the risks of double taxations, and consumes significant resources, both on the side of tax administrations and businesses. And that is why tax certainty fits directly into business decisions. It's not the only factor, of course, but it's for sure a well-weighted one. Because in our experience, the message is very clear. Jurisdictions that can provide tax certainty are simply more attractive for investment. Businesses often value predictability over optimization, particularly when the alternative is prolonged uncertainty, repeated controversy, and also the possibility of unresolved double taxation. And this is especially relevant in developing economies, where the stakes of getting the investment framework right are the highest, both for governments and investment. And in this context, an effective competent authority function matters enormously, because where the competent authority is credible and is accessible, absolutely change the business behavior in practice, because companies are more willing to engage early, to be transparent, to start communication with them, and to rely on tax certainty tools such as MAPs and APAs as part of their normal business planning, that rather than only talking to them in a post dispute once the dispute has escalated. So in our view, the more effective the compliance and certainty framework is, the more taxpayers will approach the authorities in advance to discuss issues, to provide information proactively, and to help prevent future disputes. So in summary, I would say that an effective competent authority functions is one of the clearest signals that a jurisdiction is serious about being investable, because it reduces friction, supports compliance, lowers controversy, and provides businesses with the necessary confidence to commit capital in the long term.
Thank you, Rocio. I think the message is loud and clear to set us off on the right foot. I think that this is in line with the messages we had seen, because if you remember, in 2013, the IMF and the OECD had done a tax certainty report with some surveys from MNEs. And just like you said, Rocio, certainty and predictability in the environment, an environment of trust where the taxpayer and tax administration can work together, has been valued much more than other things that a jurisdiction can offer in that sense, right? So I think the message is clear that when you feel that the environment is predictable, business feels they are secure to invest into, to expand, to operationalize in jurisdictions. So I think that there is a nice segue there to move to our competent authority colleagues then. And perhaps I turn to you, Vinay, then, because India has seen a major shift over the past decade towards tax certainty with a much more active competent authority function and greater use of MAP and APAs from taxpayers in a system where historically the domestic remedies used to be more dominant in a sense. So could you expand on what could have driven that change and how do you think taxpayers have responded to what the government has done here?
Yeah, thanks, Shriyam. So I think it's all started with a very clear message and a good understanding of, where we were, what was probably not going exactly in the way it should be, and probably what we need to do more. Now, taxes are a sensitive issue, for the government, for the officials. Now we are somewhat isolated from the department as such, but still, even for us, it's and we see it every day. It's not so easy even for the competent authorities, to give up taxes, which have been, kind of imposed after a lot of effort, due diligence, and it's not that easy. But so the message was very clear that tax certainty is probably more important, at the margins. And I'm talking about the margins. Nobody can say probably that the tax is not important. Every government needs taxes and we will have to have it. But the disputes really are around the margins. And that is where it really, really a call has to be taken as to where you look for your final preferences, priorities, whether it is just you keep on, living with tax uncertainty in search of that marginal tax which is being disputed, or you kind of, find a solution to that and then live with it. So that is where it started. But I would say that we also had a vision. The vision was that tax disputes, once they have happened, and Roshio said something about it, and I'm kind of, referring to that as well. Probably the vision was that providing a certainty in advance, I'm doing something which will basically kind of create confidence in the taxpayers, the investors, to come within the territory of India, do business with us, is something that was probably even more important. That is what you see in the success of our APA program. APAs, and we have been working very hard to make sure that the advanced pricing agreement is actually turns out to be a tax certainty in advance. We have been working with the taxpayer, trying to tell them, sometimes requesting them to, file applications a little bit more in advance, particularly in renewal cases and so on, so that we have time, to resolve those cases and give them a tax certainty even before the period of APAs begin. We all know that it takes about anywhere between 30 to 40 months, or 25 to 40, actually more than the 24 months prescribed for a MAP resolution is generally taken by the APA, but we are working on it. So on one hand, of course, the tax resolution in the disputes which have already arisen is very important. At the same time, the vision that we have is more in favor of advanced tax certainty, working with that. We had a discussion last time, on the compliance kind of a program, those programs that OECD advocated a decade back or so. And we'll be very interesting in even working on those things. So the government has taken many other steps, safe harbors, simplification of act. We are trying to create an overall comprehensive information in favor of tax certainty. That is where we are. So.
Thank you very much, Vinay. I think that resonates the message that we heard during Tax Certainty Day last year, because we had the pleasure of having Sri Ravi Agarwal, who is the chairman of the Central Board of Direct Taxes, and I think his message too was that we have been talking about needing certainty and predictability, that we should take strong steps as a global community to move from just saying tax certainty to giving tax confidence to investors and businesses worldwide. And I think that was a strong message. So I think that the investment that you have made in the competent authority program on the MAP and APA space is very clear to the world as well, and that's much appreciated. But I think with that, maybe I can turn to Harmark, because I think as chair of the FTA MAP Forum, you also have a global picture of competent authorities and the functioning, but you of course also have the picture from the Netherlands perspective, right? So does this broader link between an effective competent authority function, tax certainty and investment also fit what you see globally through the MAP Forum and also in the Netherlands?
Well, thank you, Shiram, and nice to be on this panel too. I subscribe also to the words of Vinay, who mentioned like it starts with a vision. And we can all be in favor of tax certainty, and that I think also over the years it has become more important for business and also for governments alike. But it is not only about the tax certainty in terms of dispute resolution. I think also on the prevention side we see a difference in countries moving forward with cooperative compliance programs. And what we did in the Netherlands before starting a bit more on the broader perspective is also to bring those together. So to make sure that the interaction between the tax administration and taxpayers can be more upfront, with more certainty and more trust building in the system, so that you're not afraid to go to a tax administration and ask for a certain confirmation or discussion on how to apply certain rules on a domestic level, but also on an international level. And I think that's one of the key drivers to build trust into the system. But and I think that spirit we took also into account into our competent authority, where we try as much as we can to establish relationships with taxpayers upfront to avoid that we coming into conflicts later on, that certain procedures were not going well or certain formalities were not met. But I think if you look at it a bit more broader, what we see on balance too is that we see a lot of more pre-filings coming in, where taxpayers want to have assurance with which countries things are working well, where you need to be aware of in certain countries. And that's also, I think, a matter of trust, where you see that the more credible CA, the competent authority functions, also builds better relationships amongst each other. It's easier to have a direct interaction with each other. It's better to understand what certain countries' positions are. And that also is more easy than to solve cases because you know each other. And that is also, I think, a trust basis. And I think the whole overall, what we have seen since 2016 is because of the peer reviews and BEPS Action 14, that global community of competent authorities working together and having an understanding how things could move forward is a major step forward we see on a broader scale, I think.
Thank you, Hermark. I think that you touch on a very good point here, because the competent authority is this independent bastion of trust for businesses, taxpayers, to get certainty. And I think it has been that way for many years now. But I think the value proposition for jurisdictions is also clear, that when you invest into the competent authority function, traditionally, maybe a couple of decades back, you had your audit function go through a whole audit process, arrive at an adjustment, and then many years later, wait for the taxpayer to dispute it and then go to the competent authority function. Whereas now this proactive dispute resolution mindset has allowed you, in an APA context, for example, that a business can come to you and try and get certainty for multiple years, right? So I think that mindset is reflecting very clear, and I think it's coming to competent authorities across the globe, across lines of development. So that's a positive and good message for us. Maybe from there, I can ask Muvoli from Zambia's perspective, because this is something that Zambia has recently invested in, because we went through the Action 14 peer review process with Zambia, where we worked with you to try and see how we can improve the functioning of MAP programs in your jurisdiction. So do you think that the recent investments that you have made in the MAP program has already started to change the way MAP is viewed domestically?
Thank you and good afternoon. Certainly, actually, I must say that Zambia from around 2020 moved from nothing, because we had a situation where we had a transfer pricing unit, and when there was, taxpayers felt aggrieved, they didn't know exactly where to go, so they would write back to the transfer pricing unit, and the transfer were like, wait a minute, these are not the same people that are supposed to deal with this grievance or issue with the taxpayer. So with the help of the OECD, I must say, and thank you very much, Shiram, you worked very closely with us. I think we moved from that space to having a space where we have a small team, which was under the International Tax Unit, that started getting training, and put in place, the MAP manual, put in place the MAP practice note that we publicized to the public to make sure that they were aware. And much as we have a very small MAP program, especially internationally, I think domestically, we have a lot of Zambian taxpayers that are aware that, they can access MAP
from other jurisdictions where they have business interests and whatnot. So yeah, we certainly have come a long way, and it's moving from stride to stride. And for us, actually, the key under tax certainty is, I think, ensuring that we don't get to a place of MAP to the MAP program, very much so right now. So for us, tax certainty is dispute prevention first. And then, of course, if we do get to a place where we have to provide MAP, then we have the team now in place and a competent authority to deal with that.
Thank you, Muvali. I think you've touched on some interesting things here. Of course, prevention first is the message of this whole segment, right? I think all the competent authorities, as well as Rosia from Business, has said that eventually proactively preventing a dispute is the priority. I think that's number one. But I think a couple of things you talked about the MAP program are interesting too, that first, the minute information is widely accessibly available for taxpayers, then they know that there is this competent authority function that will deal with MAP. So that is of key importance. And I can tell you that even developed countries who had MAP cases previously have told me that the minute they published their MAP guidance, suddenly taxpayers that they did not expected also realized that there is this program called MAP, etc., especially for individuals, for example, right? So I think there is a key point there for us to think about. And I think resources is also interesting because you say that you've invested in people, but also in training people both on the mindset required for MAP, but also the independence required, right? Because I think in most of these sessions, I always emphasize the point that as a competent authority for MAP, your role is to be an officer of the tax treaty. So that perspective that you will be enforcing the tax treaty in the right spirit is something also that your function needs to get through, right? So I think it's great that you have invested into that program in that sense. But that takes me to the next segment that I had in mind, and that is a little bit more diving into the MAP programs and what specific features of MAP programs make them effective in practice. So maybe on this one, as chair of the MAP Forum, Harmark, I will give you the first words on this because, of course, you are the chair and you are a competent authority of the Netherlands, which has one of the most mature programs. And every year we see on Tax Certainty Day that you walk away with 1 or 2 awards. So I think it makes sense that you answer this question. What do you see globally as the main features that make a MAP program effective and credible, particularly if the object is to support development through tax certainty?
Thank you, Shriram. And just to highlight that there is no coincidence between being a chair and winning awards. And that's objectively determined, I can tell. But that aside, I think also and what was mentioned by Sambia too, and yourself as well, like the moment you publish MAP guidance, taxpayers come to you and ask for solutions. And that you can see, well, if I didn't publish anything, I don't get MAP cases. But it also means that people did not came to you. That either was they accepted a non-resolved issue, or they just maybe moved away and did not cost investment. And in the broader tax certainty agenda, I think this is a key issue you don't want to get into. And over the years, I think what we've seen in the peer reviews is the, let's say, countries with more experience in MAP over the past decades, and that were being evaluated, and that were also not there where they should have been. So there you see a lot of improvements on the last years going on as well. But also countries with lesser experience or even no MAP experience now come to the realization we need also something to do with tax certainty. And if you then talk to them and also what makes an effective competent authority organization, the first and foremost important thing I would say would be place them in a part of the organization where you give them sufficient authority and independence. Because the interaction with audit is there, and you need to make sure that your competent authority can operate independent and can make decisions to uphold the rights under the treaty and the obligations under the treaty, and not per se your domestic law interest as such. Also, I think it's very important to have to hire and train very skilled people. They have expertise in transfer pricing and in treaty interpretation issues. But I think also the mindset training, and you alluded to that as well, like the only thing you have to resolve is a case or prevent a dispute based on the terms of the treaty. And that is the thing we as competent authorities have in common. And this is also my relationship. It's my relationship with treaty partners and taxpayers that I have to manage, and also to make sure that I meet my obligations too. And I think one of the things we not much say, but I think training them in cultural diversity is also a very important aspect, because what is normal in the Netherlands is generally not normal in the rest of the world. So to be able to build relationships, to build trust, and to also show respect for other countries, you need to also have a bit of understanding how their culture works. If only to say, if you want to get an agreement, it's helpful that you don't offend other people, of course, and that you get in a good cooperation mood. And I think the published guidance was one of the things, but it's very important to understand for taxpayers too how the system works in your country. One very small example, the interaction with domestic remedies. It may be very important to make a decision on which system you choose, whether you want an APA or not. And having a good understanding starts with having guidance on the system in place. And the last one, I would say, be open and constructive also towards taxpayers, to liaise with them upfront to see whether you can prevent disputes and avoid disputes as such, because what you mentioned, going from audit to a resolution process can take very long, but it also may produce unnecessary work. So prevention in that sense is also avoiding too much resources being dragged into a resolution process.
Thank you, Hermark. Yes, I think that what you have really talked about here is essentially competent authority is a relationship-based function, and this involves a relationship between competent authorities with the taxpayer as well, and all in a sense working together to this goal of avoiding taxation not in accordance with the treaty. And this treaty is the instrument that allows you in that sense to overcome restrictions that you may have otherwise under your system, right? So I think that mindset, that mentality that you alluded to, it's what we try to work on in the FTA MAP Forum, and I think that some of the messages that you mentioned here are also something we commonly talk about in the MAP trainings and the workshops that we do, for example, right? Because when we want a transfer pricing expert to come to the transfer competent authority, you might move them from the examination function into the competent authority function, but then the difference is not a substantive training, it's more the mindset, and it's a completely different mindset that's required. So I think you've touched on some good important points. But moving to Vinay on this question then, so looking at India's experience, what do you think are the investments that India have made that made the biggest practical difference in turning MAP into a real and trusted route for taxpayers?
Yeah, Sriram, what I'm going to speak is probably more out of the things that I have observed, maybe the observations that we were able to make from our experience, I would say. I'm not so sure whether one can take those as very kind of, as broad guidelines for everyone. I'm not trying to say anything like that, but these are just observations. So with an experience of around a decade or so of being a part of the competent authority team, and plus being a competent authority myself, what we have seen is that we have tried different things, investing in manpower, investing in skills, in investing. But what we have seen, the best outcomes generally we have found coming from investing in the relationships, the competent authority relationships. That is where I think finally this is what we have come to analyze and understand, that we need to work along with the other competent authority and develop a good understanding. There's no substitute probably to that. It's very important that we keep in touch, that we keep virtual calls or something. We make sure that we are always on the same page about what we are going to do with a particular case, the next steps and all. And I'm particularly thankful to all the competent authorities that we are working with, and many of our bigger partners like the United States, for instance. Very thankful to them that, we have been able to work with them in a manner which is where both of us feel very comfortable, and we have a good understanding of what is going to work, what is not going to work. So what is important in this probably is to understand the constraints of the other competent authority. And as you pointed out, Mark Pitt pointed out earlier, that the culture of the other country, and so there are so many things in their laws and all, and this is what we expect from the other competent authority. We, as a competent authority, I do work under a lot of limitations, some of which you are already putting into a peer review report as well. which is out already. Drafts are all out. We keep on discussing that, and of course we'll keep on trying to do whatever we can. But coming back to the relationship, I think that is what's most important about. But then there are some certain other things as well. Processes, for instance, like information symmetry between the three stakeholders, that the two competent authorities and the taxpayer, we believe it's of utmost importance. I mean, if there is good information symmetry before we actually come to the discussions table, then we can save a lot of time. That is the probably, I mean, that's a great substitute of manpower. That's a great substitute, so even for skills and everything else, because very often we have found that we start discussing and then we realize that the facts which that were placed between the two competent authorities were not exactly the same. So our understanding of the case itself is so different. And that is what, so we put a lot of emphasis on making sure with other treaty partners that, the competent authorities are the competent authorities, that we make sure that there is a full information symmetry. We make our rules like, whatever we are sharing with one competent authority, please make sure that it is shared ad verbatim with the other competent authority, so that all of us are looking at the same thing and we are coming prepared, knowing very well as to what is the feedback that you have provided to the other competent authority. That is one point. Then again, when we say investment, or the manner in which we are going, then we all know that negotiations are always a give and take. Now, the give and take means there has to be a flexibility. And the flexibility, always is a contradiction to a principled approach. Now, we have tried both, and we have seen the constraints that different competent authorities have. So it's very important that you understand what kind of level of flexibility is required with the particular other competent authority. You respect that, along with the fact that how principled approach they are likely to follow. And at the same time, keep on working together, to have a right balance in your relationship for resolving cases. Because at the end of the day, it is pragmatic solutions which develop the trust, not only between the two competent authorities, but also with the taxpayer, that things are going to come out. And I'm saying particularly, one example I like to share is the kind of, old legacy cases, the most difficult cases which have been pending for, let's say, years and years together, where taxpayers are also not very sure whether anything is going to happen. So we have to work hard. I mean, most of these cases are unlikely to be solved by a principled approach. They are probably, these are the ones which require a lot more flexibility, a pragmatic approach. And getting that pragmatic approach is not just a solution for those disputes, but they're also in an investment into the tax certainty environment that you are building as a trust with taxpayer and other competent authorities around the globe. So it's an investment, I would say. And we at times, we are willing to give up those principled and rigid positions just to get those pragmatic solutions so that we can move on. I mean, we have to get rid of those obstacles on an expressway if we want to actually have a clear expressway and move forward in future. So these are some of the, investments, give and take. And once we are willing to indulge in all of them, then probably we find the road is a bit clear, and sooner or later we start moving faster. So initially, it's always much more difficult, but as you move on, if you are perseverant enough, and thankfully with all of our competent authorities, we have a good experience and we have gradually improved. And I would say this is the way we have improved what you're talking about. The things that have improved in India in the last few years is largely because of this approach.
Thank you very much, Vinay. Of course, I have to emphasize that with your years of experience in the competent authority function, these are really words of wisdom for jurisdictions too, especially jurisdictions that are looking to invest more, seeing how to develop this function more, because like you say, building that relationship, ensuring that you have the right mindset to try and find solutions, because we talk about the treaty requiring you to not resolve. The treaty does not require you to resolve a case all the time, but the treaty requires you to endeavor, right? So there is that obligation. So it goes to the heart from a treaty perspective of what does endeavor really mean. And I think you sum that up very well, that it is actually making sure you have best efforts and good faith with a pragmatic solution-oriented approach with the other competent authorities. So I think that that's a very good message for all of us to keep in mind. With that, I can turn to Muvoli then, because I think it's a little connected, and I think we have a little bit of a direction that we're moving in this panel as well. Because over the years, I think that we see, like we discussed and you mentioned too, Zambia has been investing in developing its MAP function, its competent authority function. So I wanted to ask more specifically, what have you been able to put in place so far, and what benefits are you starting to see from those investments?
Okay, so I think, like I said, putting in place the MAP guidance in terms of the practice note and the manual actually for the officers under the MAP competent authority to be able to use. And also, I think one thing that has been very, very helpful for us has been the peer learning process that we have had through the OECD, through attending the MAP Forum meetings, attending the peer reviews for other jurisdictions. So even the simplified peer review process for us in 2023 was like a great learning experience for the designated small team that has been put in place to work on MAP. So yeah, basically that, and consistency in trying to make sure that the team is constantly learning. We have a huge challenge in that the officers that are under the treaties do not necessarily have transfer pricing experience. So for us, that is something that they have to keep learning, because the two cases that we've had on our program came from transfer pricing, obviously. So for us to be able to work with the taxpayer and the other jurisdiction, the team has to understand where this is coming from and whatnot.
Thank you, Muvoli. I think that talks a little bit about the multilateral engagement too, and I think it's important we recognize that, right? Because when we started in the inclusive framework, the idea was that we did the Action 14 peer reviews for 5 or 6 years for the jurisdictions with more meaningful MAP experience. But at one point, there was this thought that when a jurisdiction wants to invest more into a program and is setting up, maybe the taxpayers are not aware, and maybe we need multilateral support and we need help to provide to that jurisdictions. And I think that led to the creation of this simplified peer review process that you mentioned under Action 14. The idea was that we can help at the secretariat level, but also the MAP Forum itself with 140 plus countries and competent authorities, see how we can support the development of a competent authority program. But then you also, like you said, have the experience of having the discussions for each jurisdiction, which may include your peers, which may include jurisdictions that have not developed as much as you have, but also jurisdictions that have developed more, right? So I think that whole array of experiences is something that we've been able to thankfully create in the MAP Forum, that we have that environment for peer learning and exchange, and I think that's something to note too. But finally, to wrap up this segment, Rocio, so which features in a competent authority function do you think business considers the biggest difference on whether taxpayers actually trust in MAP or NAPAs or not?
Well, as for maps, I think that the key question is straightforward. Is MAP a real and usable tool in practice, or it's merely a formal write on paper? Because trust will depend much less on the legal architecture alone and much more on whether the process is accessible, is responsive, and is credible in real terms. Because in the end, what business look for are workable solutions. So to me, a credible competent authority function sends several clear signals. First, it's accessible, meaning that there is effective access to MAP, there is clear guidance, and there are no artificial barriers to entry the process. Second, it's transparent, meaning that taxpayers understand the process, timelines, and how their case will be handled. And that means that you know where to file, what information is required, what procedural path your case will follow. And in this regard, it was mentioned before, and I think we are very aligned in this, MAP profiles, domestic guidance, even practical handbooks, I think are very valuable. Third, competent authority should be responsive and well-resourced, meaning that there is enough people in the teams, but also continuity in the team, sufficient technical expertise, and meaningful communication throughout the process. Because businesses can work with difficult issues and even long cases if they can see that the process is alive, it's moving forward, that a solution can be envisaged. Because otherwise, we can end up with a solution that arrives very late. And in this scenario, tax certainty loses much of its practical value. And finally, I would say that competent authorities should be solution-oriented, meaning that the audit teams and competent authorities work in a coordinated, non-duplicative way, rather than creating another layer of controversy. And finally, I would say that the ultimate test is whether the process delivers real outcomes. In other words, do cases move forward? Are agreements effectively reached and implemented? Because that really changed the conversation. So taxpayers trust and use the map when the process is accessible, is communicative, is transparent. So when we see that there is a real value for us. And not to go longer, I would say that similar features would apply to APAs. The more agile, efficient, communicative, and transparent the competent authorities are, the more attractive the APAs will be for taxpayers.
Thank you, Rocio. I think that your intervention was a brief summation of what we agreed as best practices in the MEMAP, and I think that is actually a very good sign that competent authorities and taxpayers are aligned on that, right? In the sense that creating an environment that prevents disputes, having an effective competent authority function, ensuring access, ensuring the right mindset for endeavors, ensuring that even if you agree at the competent authority level, you eventually need the solution implemented by the field, right? So starting through the life cycle and thinking from top to bottom is a little important, and it's good that we have sort of taxpayers in this room to keep reminding us of that. But I think that the other side of that is always too that we also know that you as business are users of the map process, right? So in that manual too, we tried to highlight the fact that, of course, the taxpayer is not directly part of a map process, but the taxpayer should be informed as the process goes along, just to be sure that the taxpayer knows where the case is progressing. But on the other hand, I think Vinay mentioned too that the taxpayer is also as much part of the process, and they cooperate with information symmetry, and taxpayers work together with competent authorities. So I think it ties up the whole picture that we really establish here through your intervention too, Rocio, that we are all working together towards the same goal. I think that's the important part here. But now that we have talked a little bit about best practices and what works best in MAP, still important, and I noticed that we are running a little short of time, but important to think about remaining challenges and how to address them too. On that, maybe I start with you, Muvoli, because in the end, for Zambia, like you mentioned, it is a program that you are developing. Few map cases, taxpayers have not come a lot, but they're starting to. But you do see transfer pricing controversy, for example, in courts, right? So from Zambia's perspective, what are the constraints that you still see in making map more effective, or your competent authority function more effective? And what do you think that Zambia's sort of thought on way forward is on this process?
I think basically resource constraints. I think we did get feedback from one of our treaty partners that we need to invest a little bit more in the team. Like I said, we have a small team, and that's the same team that works on tax treaties and other international tax issues. So definitely resource and staffing constraints. Then, of course, we have limited case experience and technical expertise in the in MAP, and we are dealing with more experienced treaty partners. So I think we definitely need to allocate more resources in terms of training, continuous and consistent training for the team to ensure that we are up to speed with everything.
Thank you, Muvali. Yes, I think that perspective is something that we hear from jurisdictions that are continuing to invest in the process. But I think I can say assuredly that if you ask Harmark or Vinay, they will also say that they continuously need more resources and they continuously need to invest into this process too. So irrespective of which jurisdiction we talk to, I think that is a common trend that we see, that eventually this program, whether it be MAP or APS, is something that taxpayers want to have more of. And for that, we need to continuously think of resourcing, how the resources should be organized. And for example, we always say in our training events that it may be that you have 100 simple cases and you could do that with 5 or 10 people. And it could be that you have only 10 very complex people and you may need 5 or 10 people for those two, right? So it's very difficult to determine. It's very inventory specific. So I think resourcing, thinking about a competent authority function is definitely one of those key challenges. But I think the other thing, sort of like experience and working with treaty partners, I hope that investing more into the program, the multilateral engagement is helping you in that direction. On that, I can turn to you, Harmark. Again, as MAP Forum chair and also coming from the Netherlands Competent Authority, what do you think are some ideas on how these challenges that we heard from Muvoli can be addressed?
Thank you, Sriram. And I think it's true indeed that we can always hire more people, but some countries, the inventories have also quadrupled. And there is a certain limitation as to the number of people you can hire. And I think we also have to move towards more smarter general solutions to avoid a lot of cases coming in. And that are not per se coming for all countries. But I think for my own country too, we have a lot of cross-border cases for individuals. They actually may not need to be in the MAP process. So we may need to find tools within certain ranges where we can prevent these cases reaching that state, to have less cases in inventory and there's also less constraint on resources. But I think that's for all countries, it goes the resources issues, but also for countries that need to develop and build a system. I think there are multiple ways to come there. One of them, of course, is come to the MAP Forum, liaise with your treaty partners, learn from them and interact with them. But I think also what would be very helpful is too that we created like a pool of persons with experience, either retired persons or still active in the competent authority function, to who countries can or who can liaise with and see how did you manage to establish this, or did you run against to this problem? How did you solve it, and what are ways to come forward? And I think from a Dutch perspective too, we're always very willing to help and engage with treaty partners. Even though we did not invent the wheel, we can always give you examples of how we perceive things and how we try to improve things. And I think too, another issue is that we need to work in the MAP Forum maybe too, and to more common approaches to avoid these cases coming back. And especially also in the prevention side, where we focus a lot on APAs, there may be also appetite to move away only from transfer pricing and see where we can find ways to prevent disputes, also beyond transfer pricing issues, I would say.
Thank you, Harmark. I think that at last year's Tax Certainty Day, we shared a panel together on the statistics, and we were looking at the statistics where we see every year competent authorities close more cases, but the closing of cases is very hard to keep up with the opening of new cases, right? And that is the problem. So you're right that focusing on prevention is really the thing we can do. But I think you raise a good point that focusing on prevention, how we can do more prevention at a competent authority level by agreeing common approaches. A good example as I transition to Vinay is I know that India and the US has a framework agreement on certain types of transfer pricing cases. And that, since that has been agreed, you see a lot of APAs and MAPs being resolved in that space, right? So maybe solutions like that could be a way for resolving the challenges and ensuring that your inventory is managed well. So that's a direction to think of. But Vinay, I'd like to hear from you too, because I think you are in the middle of that evolution in a sense from India, because you mentioned some of the challenges before, and I think you share them still, but you are continuing to work on that. So maybe good to hear your perspective on how India is working on those challenges.
Yeah, actually, I would say that we share many constraints with those jurisdictions who are just setting their map up. I don't know whether that will cheer them up sufficiently, but yes, that's true. Manpower is always an issue. The fact that you are, what Mark just pointed out, I mean, you also did probably that we keep on getting more cases than we resolve. So like its success leads to its own challenge, and the more taxpayers follow the path that you are going, and we end up with more work burden rather than less. We begin with the hope that our inventory will be smaller, but it ends up becoming larger because more people now trust the CA function, and then they are coming to us instead of going to the home remedy. So that is one. The other thing I would say is that like when we're dealing with the jurisdictions which have newly put up their programs and all, one thing is that you need to be a little more patient. And this is not something that you have to do only with those countries, but in fact, whenever you are starting with a treaty partner, you have to do it. It's just that when you're dealing with a jurisdiction with home, you're either the experience is less, or maybe your experiences are different. Then you have to be, you have to find out as to what can be done, to bridge those gaps, to have a better understanding, be more patient, find out what the limitations they are. And sometimes, there can be a difficulty in understanding because the pace at which the two sides wish to work can be, different. And that is where, unless, we are willing to adjust our pace, and come at the same level, things can be a little different. So these are some of the things that maybe can possibly work. But many of the other things, as you really pointed out, complex cases, they can be difficult. So one way forward could be, to deal with the lower hanging fruits first. And you talked about, that framework or something, but it's just the framework is just like it's an understanding. And that understanding you can develop. And this is what I was talking about, that when you work with a competent authority to resolve one case, and some of them are pragmatic and they are kind of not replicable. But at other times, in fact, most of the others are replicable. You try to get some resolutions which are replicable, and you have an understanding. So being patient and working together, that's probably the key.
Thank you, Vinay. Yes, I often hear that competent authorities are victims of their own success in a sense, that the more work you do, the more that keeps coming your way. So I think that's a fair point. But you're right that I think that trying to replicate success, I think you have made this point to me often, that once you do an APA correctly, even if it takes a little bit more time, the renewal in a quick way, in a sensible way, is where your success lies, because you could do renewals 2 or 3 times and suddenly get 15 years and 20 years of tax certainty. So I think you're right that doing it right the first time could actually lead to replicable good results. So that's something to think about too. To close this off, I think, Rosia, from a business perspective too, I think it's important. You heard of some challenges in this panel, right? And I think it's a good chance for you to react on that too, to see what do you think are the key features at a base level that most quickly build confidence for you as a business in going into MAP in a jurisdiction.
Well, I think that that's a key question, because I think that many developing countries at the moments are in that exact position. They have the legal framework, they have signed the treaties, but maybe the practical infrastructure to go over a map is still being built. So to me, what can make the biggest difference in the short time, first, and maybe the most impactful step, is providing clear and accessible information on MAP policy and MAP practices, because it's important that taxpayers know that the process exists and how it works and what to expect. Secondly, I would say predictability and responsiveness are equally important. Even where a program is new and resources are limited, timely acknowledgement of the cases, clear procedural milestone, and regular communication, I think they are key to build trust. Because taxpayer can understand that complex cases may take time, but the perception that the cases they are forget, I think that undermines trust. Also, I see very important that competent authority should demonstrate that it takes MAP processes very seriously at an institutional level. And it means ensuring that competent authority teams have adequate resources, but also that they have this institutional support behind. Because from a taxpayer's perspective, if you see that a government has invested in building this capacity and it has the support of the OECD, United Nations, peer jurisdictions, it is a signal of a good environment. And finally, I would highlight also the role of international cooperation and capacity building, because the more best practices are shared and competent authority resources are trained, the more efficient the processes will be. So I think that, in summary, confidence is built fastest when businesses can see that the program is real and will add value to us.
Thank you, Rocio. I think it's good that we come full circle, because you talked in the broadest picture about things like this, and now from a MAP and competent authority program to wrap us up, you also say that at a base level, having that approachability, that predictability in the environment allows you as a business to safely go to a competent authority, right? And be sure that you will get you will have a voice for them to answer, and that you will actually get something that you think is predictable. So in that sense, I think it's good that we wrap up that discussion on that note. It's been great hearing all of your perspectives, both from the competent authority, across lines of development, as well as from business. We have a couple of minutes, so maybe I will take a couple of questions which are already in the chat. And I see that there is a question from Martin Bergwerk where he had mentioned that it would be good to hear from the panelists. I think his question in a couple of lines is sort of surrounding how do we evolve the MAP process, and even though it's currently a government to government process, is increased involvement of taxpayers something that you're thinking about? Maybe I turn to you, Harmark, because you have the broader perspective of the MAP Forum on this.
Thank you, Sriram. I think what Rocio also mentioned, like the approachability of a competent authority is the first step, I would say. You need to be able to have an open engagement, I would say, prior to even going to an official filing, to have an interaction, to have an understanding what is expected and what your role as a taxpayer is. And I think even though it's a government-to-government process, one key element is, of course, that the taxpayer also gives the same information to all the parties involved, to avoid that there is a difference between the parties and that they cannot continue until they have all the same information. But in a broader sense, indeed, it is a government-to-government process. And to change that structure, which has been, I think, in literature criticized also a lot, it's difficult, because then you have to change the structure as such. It's an engagement between two treaty partners on how to apply their mutual treaty for an individual case. But of course, I do fully recognize that the taxpayer's money is at stake, and not having a formal role in the process is one thing, but not being informed throughout the whole process is a second step. So I think for competent authorities too, they need to be transparent where they can be transparent, to inform them, and you don't need to inform everybody of each step in the process. But I think, Rocio, if you have a case, you want to know, have positions been exchanged? Is there a meeting? When can I expect a certain solution? And especially, I think, and that's something on the implementation side too, where we want a feedback loop in the Netherlands. If things are not going good, we need to know why, so that we can make sure it works better. But I think for transfer pricing cases especially, and this is something we have not thought of very well, especially in the Netherlands, not yet, how to implement transfer pricing cases going forward if you don't get an APA. Because settling a dispute on a number is fine for a taxpayer to have the dispute resolved, but how to move forward in terms of your documentation, transfer pricing policy, and etc. And there I think we need to interact also more as competent authorities with taxpayers to avoid recurring issues coming in. So to answer Martin, I can do a lot, but not change the system as such. Then you need really be within Sriram's park. But I think we can make a major step forward in having more interaction with taxpayers throughout the process.
No, thank you, Harmark. I think from my end too, I can reiterate that, right? Because when we dealt with this in MAP in a section specifically for taxpayers, I think the idea was that we accept MAP to be what it is. And what it is, like when I mentioned, creates a lot of successes, right? Because and that leads to being solution oriented, working together in a relationship dynamic. In that system, it is accepted that it's a government to government process. But within that, it's important to think about what can basically the taxpayer expect from the process. And we touched on this a little bit, that the taxpayer should be informed at every step of the process. And I think we hear of cases where that does not happen. And I think that's not the right thing either, because the taxpayer is the user of MAP. So we need to ensure that competent authorities inform taxpayers throughout. But on the other hand, if the taxpayer is accepting that they would accept the solution that avoids double taxation, then this system lends itself to that. So I think that's the point that I would say too. I don't think we have more open questions, only something which is a comment. So maybe just since we have 1 minute left, I will thank our panelists and wrap up with a couple of thoughts, I think, because I think we heard a lot of things today. We heard tax certainty is key for investment, trade, growth. More certainty influences business decisions. It even improves voluntary compliance because taxpayers trust the system more. We heard that information on MAP, like MAP guidance, MAP profiles, when taxpayers know MAP, including the policy positions on things like interaction with domestic remedies that Harmark mentioned, taxpayers are likely to access MAP more, which is good. The thing that competent authorities can do is that when they create a MAP function, they create a MAP function that is independent, that is focused on trying to find resolutions in line with the treaty without revenue targets, for example, to try and solve it in line with the treaty. They need to have substantive training from a treaty and transfer pricing perspective, but also on the mindset to find solutions in a pragmatic way, find middle grounds to try and offer relief for the taxpayer. I think the relationship aspect every one of you has touched on. But investment in relationships, I think, is the key that I will end on. Competent authority and the process works on that basis between each other as well as with taxpayers. And I think the FTA MAP Forum has facilitated that for competent authorities. And forums such as these allows us to have open dialogue with taxpayers. So I think that's something to highlight. I will close by saying that I would encourage all of you to have a look at the MAP, which includes best practices and guidance from the start to end of the MAP process, both for taxpayers as well as competent authorities. We have tried to say that this is how the ideal MAP process should work, right? So I think questions on MAP, how to approach MAP should start from there, but all the competent authorities are available for you if you have issues that you would want to be resolved through MAP or APS. But thank you very much to all of you for all of your time. I think that I will close the session with that then, and I will say thank you and see you soon. Thank you.